In 1998, this was pretty cool. Today, superhero films rule the global box office. This wasn't always the case. There was one film that may have had a hand in changing that: Blade. Most people probably feel like the initial 4-color films that made a significant impact are Iron Man, or one of the other initial raft of MCU films, but that may not necessarily be true. Going back even further, the two-fisted onslaught of 2000's X-Men and 2002 Spider-Man are more ubiquitously credited as the initial foray that spawned the now seemingly never-ending series of big-budget superhero movies we keep seeing hit our screens. But there's a group of people that believe that that may not be right either. Instead, there's a separate belief picking up traction on the internet, and that's that the 1998 Wesley Snipes vehicle Blade, directed by Stephen Norrington and written by David S. Goyer, was truly the first comic book film adaptation of the current era, establishing the tone, style, and methodology that most big-budget studio pictures, based on comic books, now work from. Is it true? Well, cast your mind back to the mid-1990s when this film was first being discussed by New Line. Comic book movies and video game movies were the lowest of the low in terms of cultural respect. Yes, obviously there was Batman '89 and Superman the Motion Picture and a bevy of other films that succeeded to varying degrees, some critically, some financially, some neither, but for every one that succeeded, you had 15 Howard the Ducks, or Double Dragons, or the Super Mario Bros. Movie. But in the long run, it's Blade that had a secret weapon that none of those characters could claim: obscurity. Blade wasn't well known at all. He wasn't a prestige character with a long lineage of well-regarded stories to adapt, and it also wasn't a campy schlockfest. It was a comic book movie that wanted to be taken seriously without being hindered by the massive expectations of common ubiquity, something none of its forebears had even considered, let alone attempted. In other words, it took the source material seriously even when so few understood the source material. It wanted to ground Blade's world in our world. This was actually, at the time, a deeply comic book idea. Marvel's tagline for much of its publishing history had been "the world outside your window." And that was the same approach that Goyer and Norrington took with our favorite vampire hunter. Simply put, Blade was the first film that made everyone sit up and take notice of what a commercially viable genre comic book adaptation could be. If that little portion of this piece reminds you of anything, it should remind you that when Iron Man the film released, not but a little over a decade ago, a lesson taken there being that Iron Man was definitely not the most popular and well-known character at the time. People forget this, but there was one big difference. Blade released August 21st, 1998. It was produced off of a budget of $45 million and generated over $131 million at the global box office. Blade's success was a little more surprising. Its gritty, black leather-clad aesthetic and violent martial arts-themed action sequences helped the film stand out from the tropes and cliches of what at the time was a highly maligned subgenre. And in some ways, unlike Iron Man, what allowed Blade the film to be so successful is the massive reinvention of the titular character. The film is actually based on a supporting character in the 1973 Tomb of Dracula ongoing comic book series created by Marv Wolfman and Gene Colan. That's right, Blade literally didn't even have its own comic book series. He was a supporting monster hunter in a Dracula book. This obviously positioned him as a D-list Marvel character at best. However, Goyer, a hardcore comic book fan, envisioned a new era of the character. He was looking to redeem himself off of some not so successful projects and pitched New Line and Marvel on the idea of recontextualizing the relatively obscure character for the 1990s. That cool leather-clad action hero we just talked about was nowhere to be found in the original comics. Instead, what you would have seen there was a large green glasses sporting, supporting action hero with a luxurious afro, constantly utilizing a bandolier of wooden stakes. The comic book version of Blade was much more of a true comic book character, immensely complex and interesting to readers of the medium. However, after the heyday of his run in Tomb of Dracula, arguably not that digestible by your average reader. Which brings us back to the genius of the film version of Blade, that foundation setting. There's a streamlining of all those realities. His motivation is instantly clear. He's a man of two worlds. The duality and contradiction inherent in a vampire who hunts vampires is a conflict-ridden character that just leaps off of a screen. It helped that by the mid-1990s, Wesley Snipes was a bona fide star, but Blade was the thing that made him a household name. Couple that with some unique 90s industrial music and blood showers, and you've got yourself a cult classic. But a cult classic doesn't often kick off a 30-year-long genre that has completely consumed the popular culture landscape. So why was Blade able to become the default template for that genre? Well, it's actually kind of hard to communicate efficiently just how much of a departure the movie Blade was from the superhero films that came before throughout the 80s and the 90s. Blade had attitude, a charismatic star with a keen intensity.
You have an invitation, Kado.
And it was adopting horror aesthetics and applying them to superheroes, which at the time felt like a bold reinvention of extraordinarily tired genre tropes. In many respects, Blade was successful because it picked the best attributes of the character and disregarded literally everything else. And this would largely become the de facto stencil for every comic book hero adaptation during the 2000s. Gone were the large glasses, afro, bell bottoms. Now he was a paramilitary creature of the night. Martial arts, Kevlar, katanas, and Ray-Bans were here to stay, so much so that the comic book character began dressing exactly like his movie counterpart after the film. And it takes a lot for that cross-pollination to happen. When Batman '89 came out, DC Comics artists didn't start drawing rubber chest plates and immovable necks. When Lou Ferrigno's Hulk made his small screen's debut, Jim Shooter didn't make all the Marvel artists start drawing a mop-top hairdo on Bruce Banner. For Blade, these more grounded costume, aesthetic, and logistical changes seemed like the logical and prudent thing to do, which meant that when new comic book characters would make the leap from illustrated page to silver screen, a similar approach would be, well, the only viable option. The success of Blade is the very thing that allowed Spider-Man and the X-Men to be greenlit, with the latter opting to take creative cues from Daywalker himself. It was the first drop of water in the storm. Was the average movie-going person ready to see Cyclops, Wolverine, and Jean Grey in full-on spandex in the 2000s? No, probably not, so the creatives behind the big screen debut of Marvel's Merry Mutants opted to clad them in black leather and ground them in a distinct, emotionally charged story that mirrored our own world. Does that sound familiar? For better or for worse, this would become a standard aesthetic for superhero films going forward for pretty much the entire next decade. The Matrix, Mutant X, Daredevil, everyone essentially copied in one way or another Blade's approach of taking the comic book aesthetic and loosely translating it to leather coats. And yet there's Blade. Despite having 2 successful sequel films and a live-action TV show that ran for a season on TNT, Blade remains a solid cult film. Its long-lasting impact on the superhero genre overshadowed by the twin giants that followed it immediately in Raimi's Spider-Man series and Singer's X-Men. Should there be more discussion about the Blade film, especially the first 2? Should there be a critical analysis directly linking Blade and David Goyer's initial success to the massively influential and sometimes controversial efforts of the current DC cinematic universe? Well, Batman Begins and Man of Steel were both co-written by Goyer, so yeah, maybe. But that's a more nuanced conversation. What's much more simple is that Blade really is the first truly modern comic book adaptation to hit the silver screen. It's an adrenaline-fueled, sleek action picture that takes the best of 2 genres and mashes them up to create something that was at the time truly original. Blade in different hands, especially during that era, would have been a significantly altered film. And had it been, who knows if we'd even be in this era of superhero blockbusters. It inarguably opened the door for the MCU to truly take off. And look, it may sound like I'm a big comic book movie guy. I'm really not. I just find something like Blade so interesting because it's such an integral and interesting part of what really is film history. I guess what it really does go to show you is if you're someone in maybe film school, or maybe you're studying film on your own time, maybe you want to be a writer or director or a cinematographer, just remember that where the most obvious influences exist, there's one that likely came before it that's much less talked about, that's much less subtle, that might be more pertinent to be studying instead. That not every director you're watching and love was influenced by something so huge that it's on every best of list. Blade was a big movie, don't get me wrong, and despite its upcoming reboot, it's still not discussed in the pantheon of what makes modern blockbuster superhero film, or really modern blockbuster film at this point, what it is. Not through the 2000s, not through the 2010s, and not right now. Moral here is if you're studying art of any kind, dig deep in your influences and dig deep in what you study. If a movie about a vampire sounds ridiculous while you're hoping to write your next action epic, maybe it's not as ridiculous as you think, and even if it is, someday you just might be glad that you watched that film and have this nugget of vampire action information to pull from in your work. Well guys, that's it for today's episode of Nerdstalgic. If you enjoyed this one, obviously press the like button down below, hit subscribe so you don't miss anything that comes to this channel in the future, and on your screen right now should be 2 more episodes on Nerdstalgic, so you can click on either of those to stay right here, and hopefully I'll see you guys in the next video.